Welcome to episode 2 of the Curious Wanderer Bible Study. Today, we continue in Genesis in chapters 3 and 4. Genesis 3 to 4 is the story of the fall and the fallout from the fall. And in chapter 3, we get to an interesting thing that happens. So, let's just read chapter 3, the beginning, and I'll be reading from ESV here. So, starting in verse 1, Now the serpent was more crafty than any other beast of the field that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, Did God actually say, You shall not eat from any tree in the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, We may eat of the trees in the garden, the fruit. But God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. But the serpent said to the woman, You will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and it was a delight to the eye, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took the fruit and ate it, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. So that's verses 1 through 6. Now there are several things that we can get from this. The very first thing, though, is it's the first question in the Bible is asked here. I don't know if you noticed as I was reading, very early on, there was a question asked. The serpent, Satan, in our understanding, asks, Did God actually say, You shall not eat of any tree in the garden? And that opening foray in Genesis 3:1 leads to the fall. But there are three really interesting things to note about that question that's the pattern for most sin in our lives. First, the question causes Eve to question a basic rule that God gave her. Satan does not lie at first, you notice. He just causes Eve to question. And this is a pattern of how sin enters into our life. We question the teachings of God because typically we want something. She wanted knowledge. She was tempted to know things that God knows. So first, the question caused Eve to question a basic rule of God. The second thing to notice is the question itself is actually a subtle lie, because the serpent asks, Did God actually say, You shall not eat of any tree? Which God didn't say that. The serpent asked this to put Eve off balance and make her question for a moment, Did God deny me everything? That makes no sense, but it starts the conversation. It plants the seed of doubt, and it starts the conversation. As I mentioned earlier in the previous study, Eve, the last thing to notice, as I mentioned earlier, is Eve probably didn't hear this rule directly from God about not eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. God gave to Adam in Genesis 2:16 and 17 that rule not to eat. And Eve was created in verses 18 through 22, so right after the rule was given. Most likely, it seems that God didn't directly tell Eve not to eat it, but that Adam had to convey the information, which means that Eve was more removed from God, making her the easier target in this situation. So the three things, the question caused Eve to question a basic rule that God gave her. The question itself is actually a subtle lie, which it pops up in our lives over and over again. Is it really bad for me to go and do this thing? It's just one little thing. Should I have another drink? If you have a problem with drinking, it's just one drink. People have one drink all the time. Well, it is a problem, and you know that it's a problem, but you don't want to see it. You question that basic rule that you had. Now, from these three things, also then the third one, that Eve obviously didn't hear this, most likely didn't hear this. Now, the immediate fallout from this, and we'll see more about the fall in a few minutes, but the immediate fallout is they notice their nakedness in the next verse. Starting in verse 7, then the eyes of both were open, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loincloths. So that's verse 7 from the ESV. Noticing their nakedness is really just noticing that they're vulnerable, that they are, because of their sin, they're now vulnerable. There'll be much more fallout, but that is really the beginning of the fallout there. So the first question is, did God really say? And this is, again, a pattern for how sin enters our lives. But the second question is really interesting. It follows right after this account. So starting in verse 9, so I'll read verse 8 first. So after they had sewn the loincloths, the next one is, "And they heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man and said to him, 'Where are you?'" Second question. So the second question in the Bible is God calling out, "Where are you?" to Adam. Now, it almost seems comical, right? I mean, God calling out, "Where are you?" to Adam? Clearly, God knows where Adam was. So why did he ask? It's a very deep point, and it's God pointing out that there is separation between Adam and God because of the sin. God is calling to Adam to try and bring Adam back to God. It points out that God is always looking for us and always wants to reconcile us to him. As we separate, he wants to reconcile. Interestingly, right after God asks the question, "Where are you?" Adam answers, and in verse 10, he says, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself. So he answers immediately. This is the pattern. Oh, and by the way, it's really an honest answer, right? I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself then. It's really just gut-wrenchingly obvious what's going on there. And this is the pattern we should follow when we find ourselves sinning. We should respond to God with pure honesty. Yes, I've sinned. Yes, I've fallen short. And we all know that we have Jesus there as our Redeemer, as our bridge, as our sacrifice to bring us back into right standing. So we just have to call out, like Adam did here, and say, we're afraid, we're naked, we're vulnerable, and we need you, God. So the first question was the serpent asking, did God really say? The second question is God trying to bring Adam back to him, and Eve as well. So before we go too much further, I'd like to look at some of the consequences, because the rest of chapter 3 and chapter 4 are all about consequences. So there were immediate consequences and long-term consequences. Immediately, they realized that they were naked and vulnerable. But then, after God sees them and calls out to try and bring Adam closer, there's still punishment. There is still fallout. There is natural consequences of what happened. So first, they're banished from Eden, kicked out, told that they're going to have to, childbirth is going to be painful, and that the man is going to have to work the soil, and the soil is not going to give you very much. Everything is going to be harder. And then God places a cherubim in front of the gate to Eden with a flaming sword. Now, I don't know what a cherubim looks like, but if it's a thing holding a flaming sword, swinging it around, sounds pretty intimidating to me. And clearly it must have been intimidating, because we don't ever hear about Adam or Eve trying to get around the cherubim. So there's punishment, but God did give them something after that. So a little bit later, after they're separated, and God puts the cherubim there, in verse 21, we hear that, quote, "And the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skins and clothed them." So God, even during the punishment, is trying to help them. There's natural consequences, and he's not going to stop those. But he is going to show them some pity and get them started. So it's not all vengeance here. There's consequences of the fall, and then God trying to reconcile and help us through those, which is a pattern we should see in our lives. In chapter 4, we hear more fallout of the fall. We hear more consequences. We get the side story of Cain and Abel. I call it a side story because Cain and Abel are sort of a side branch of the history of the Jewish people. Jacob and all of his descendants didn't actually come from, they're not descendants of either Cain or Abel, they're descendants of Seth. But it's a very interesting story, Cain and Abel. Almost everybody has heard it. Cain's the older brother. He works the fields. Abel is a flock tender, and Abel's sacrifices are pleasing to God and Cain's aren't. We're not really told why. But that jealousy, that fall there because of jealousy, the consequence of the fall, that now we're not living up to what God needs from us. Cain isn't. Abel is, and he shows Cain that he is falling short. And so Cain is grumpy. He tells God, this isn't really fair. And God responds by saying, well, you know what? If you did like Abel and you gave me your first fruits, you wouldn't be in this position. Cain doesn't want to hear the truth. God's trying to reconcile Cain, point out the problem. He's going through the same pattern we've seen before, pointing out the problem, trying to reconcile him, and Cain, rather than being reconciled, kills Abel. We know this. We've heard this before, probably. And then what happens? Cain is banished to be a wanderer forever. And God tells him this. But something really cool happens there too. Cain says, I can't handle that, man. God, this is just too much for me. Why are you making me do this? I'll fall down dead. And God says, okay, I'm not doing all of that to you. I will actually put a mark on your head that says, you're still protected by God. No one should try and kill you. You're not alone. I'm still with you. Even though you're being banished and you have to wander the world because a consequence of your sin, I am still with you. Just like God gave Adam and Eve their first clothing, their first protection, God gives Cain protection as well. He doesn't take away all of the consequences, which is a pattern for our lives here on this world. We have consequences for our poor choices and for sin, but God helps us through that. So we have the first and second question. We have consequences that we see in chapters 3 and 4. And then we also have the redemption arc that we see. The first and second questions play out the pattern of sin in our lives. We question God. We drift away. God calls us back. We have fallout from those consequences. For instance, like Adam and Eve were expelled from Eden, and Cain had to wander for the rest of his life. But even with those consequences, even with the consequences God gives us, he also gives us a life raft of redemption, the animal skins for Adam and Eve, and for the mark protecting Cain, that others would recognize that he was protected by God. So we have this wonderful story playing out that plays out again and again in the Bible of we question God, we drift away, God calls us back, we still experience natural consequences, we still experience the consequences of drifting, but then God also sends us a lifeline. I hope you all have enjoyed this, and have a good rest of your day.